Good afternoon. On January 31st, 2012, almost 7 years to this day, I was in Chicago, Illinois, with some of my colleagues from the city. Now understand, I was 30 days old as a mayor, so I didn't know anything. But I went into this large conference room, and representatives from the Department of Transportation, the EPA, HUD, and all of the alphabets in the federal government gathered together at a table to answer one question: how can we assist you in Gary, Indiana? We're the federal government. We're here to help. It was a love fest. I basked in it. And it was a pretty good session, which ultimately resulted in significant work with sustainable communities. But that afternoon, after the Love Fest, we went down 2 floors to a meeting with the EPA. And the backdrop of that meeting is that Gary had been in a consent decree with the EPA and the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and lest we not forget the Department of Justice, for 20 years. And in my capacity as mayor, I inherited the role of being the special administrator for that consent decree. Talk about a gift that keeps on giving. And so as I entered into that conference room, some of the same folks who had been in that other meeting were there, or at least representatives, not the same folks. But their demeanor, their approach was totally different. And in fact, at some point they said, we're going to remove you as the special administrator because you haven't done anything. And I said, well, wait a minute. I've only been here 30 days. So you're right. I just found my way to the bathrooms, just got our administration in place, but I think you're a little premature. And as they continue to rail and talk about what we had not done, I finally stopped the woman sitting next to me and I said, let me tell you something. You don't have to tell me about the importance of clean drinking water in Gary, Indiana. I drink it. My mother drinks it. The people who had enough confidence in my elected leadership drink it. And so while I know that you're simply doing what you're supposed to do, I am committed to addressing the laundry list of things that have been ignored, quite frankly, by city government for 20 years. And we rolled up our sleeves. Now, you know, like every mayor or every person who runs for elected office, I had a plan. And I even had a platform. It was called the Blueprint. And in that blueprint, it talked all about the environment. And the interesting thing about it is that there were other aspects in the blueprint. things about economic development and criminal justice and the other issues that were important to the citizens of my community. But guess what? The criminal justice, the economic development, even the streets and sidewalks piece, I wrote them. The environmental piece, I farmed that out. But on January 31st, 2012, because I had been challenged to do something about the environment in our community, I became an environmentalist. What does that mean? And what has that meant in the city of Gary? Well, for the first time in the 20-plus year history of our consent decree, we have a ramp out. And it's a ramp out that has allowed us to, one by one, tick off the items that led to the consent decree in the first place. Now, we're not done, don't get me wrong, but we are significantly further than we were. And we didn't do it by simply installing a lot of infrastructure and raising the fees, because, quite frankly, the residents of Gary can't afford it. But we did it by did it through the installation of green infrastructure throughout the city. And we are still doing it by emphasizing sustainability in every neighborhood in the community. Let me give you an example. Our Emerson neighborhood. The Emerson neighborhood is probably one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city of Gary and one of the most challenged neighborhoods. It is the neighborhood that has the largest number of vacant and abandoned buildings. But as we looked to rebuild that neighborhood, we looked at how could we work with residents through a partnership with our local community foundation to develop a sustainable neighborhood that would allow them to see a new Emerson, if you will, and to think about newer and sustainable ways to live. And so we developed the prototype for an eco community. What does that mean to us? Well, it means that because of the absence of fresh food, we're developing an urban farm in that community. It means that we are looking at the installation of renewable energy projects in that neighborhood. It means that we piloted, and some of you heard from the Delta Institute, Eve Patel and her colleague from the Delta Institute today. We piloted the deconstruction program in that neighborhood. And we also began to look at how we could build houses, not just deconstruct and demolish houses, but build greener and cleaner houses in that neighborhood. Now, here's the irony. That neighborhood is in the footprint of U.S. Steel. We haven't gotten rid of the steel mill, and guess what? We're not trying to. It still remains as our largest employer in the city of Gary. But we're even working with U.S. Steel and our local utility company, NIPSCO, to develop renewable energy, to look at how recycling can become a part of U.S. Steel's sustainable practices, and to look at opportunities that arise when they are fined. U.S. Steel is fined as a result of their practices, harmful practices. The last example I want to give you, because I think I want to make sure people have time to ask questions, is when we came into city government, one of the most intractable problems we encountered was that of vacant and abandoned buildings. Some people said that there were 20,000 buildings in the city of Gary that were vacant or abandoned. And I said to myself, that's quite a bit. But I also knew that despite those numbers, no one really knew. And I also knew that unless I could solve the problem and unless I could quantify the problem, I could not solve the problem. And so what did we do? We took a device called the Local Data Survey that was built for Detroit, Michigan. And we went about the business over the course of a year and a half, thanks to over 200 volunteers, to count those parcels in Gary and to grade the structures that were on each parcel, those parcels that had them. So now we know how many parcels we have in the city. We know how many structures are on those parcels. And guess what? We know the condition of every one of those structures. And guess what? I've got some good news. There are only 6,500 vacant or abandoned buildings in Gary, Indiana. Now, that might not sound like good news to you, but remember, I was told that there were 20,000. In fact, I repeated it, back in the day in the beginning of January of 2012 when I didn't really know anything. But once we were able to quantify that, we were able to develop a plan that included the deconstruction work that I talked about earlier, that included the demolition work that I talked about earlier, and that not only includes taking things down, but also the installation of innovative projects that allow us to build things up. One of the biggest projects relative to demolition and eyesores was a 14-story hotel that sat next to City Hall, vacant for about 15 years. Those of you, how many of you have ever driven down the Indiana Toll Road, going to Chicago or going to South Bend? You saw the building, the old Sheraton Hotel, you could see right through it. Well, that was my project. That was one of my first initiatives. I'm going to tear the Sheraton down, and guess what? I was going to tear it down with volunteers. Talk about naive. We did get it down, and it's not as significant that we got it down, although that was a big deal. But what was significant is that we have a demonstration project in its place. People say, what are you going to put in the place of a Sheraton? A parking lot? Like hell. What are you going to put in the place of a Sheraton? I'll tell you what we put in the place of the Sheraton. We used it as an opportunity to experiment with green infrastructure so that we could know about stormwater runoff and not just use it there in that plaza, but use it all over the city. So we have a measured experiment that we can take the data from and use it to address our long-term control plan that I promised that I was going to address in January of 2012. We're gathering the data now. We used it as a place, or we're going to use it as a place that we can install a temporary ice skating rink. Now, I will tell you, I'll cut the ribbon, I won't be skating on it. I'm too old for that. And we're also using it as a place for folks who work downtown, whether it's for the city or the state or other branches of government or local businesses, to gather and enjoy outdoors downtown in the city of Gary. We have 52 parks, many of them unkempt. We're cleaning up those parks, and we just developed a nature park that has an outdoor teaching classroom for our kids. We've done so many things in the city of Gary to highlight the importance of the environment. And ultimately, here's what I understand. I have a responsibility, not just to the constituents who voted for me or even their children, to practice good stewardship in Gary. And what that good stewardship looks like is the development of renewable energy sources. It looks like the development of deconstruction, the development of parks, ensuring that our water supply is not contaminated. And while there are sometimes challenges from a resource standpoint to fulfill that responsibility of stewardship, what I find so often is that not only is it greener and cleaner, but very often it's cheaper and better. So on January 1st, 2012, I probably didn't know a whole lot. And the important part is, as the mayor and the speaker know, as I stand here on February 4th, 2018, I don't know a whole lot more. Because we all know how important it is to know what you don't know. But what I do understand is that we have to be good stewards. And that stewardship often has to come from those of you out there who are doing great work from the ground up. Thank you for allowing me to share the stage with these two gentlemen, and thank you for the work that you do.